Welcome to the 3DownNation podcast. I'm Justin Dunk, joined by John Hodge and JC Abbott. Fellas, we're fully into the off-season. My guy's been on top of it with NFL workouts, key details, and contract signings. What do you guys like most, Hodge? I'll start with you, about the month of December in the Canadian Football League.
I like the work-life balance that is severely lacking, particularly in the fall once the youth sports season starts. So when Santa's coming down the chimney with presents for everybody, I feel like the best present I get is just some time to sleep and relax. We're still hard at work, we really are, but it's nice to be able to get that work done in somewhere close to 40 hours in the week, which is just not possible during the regular season of the Canadian Football League.
I like the ability to poke my head up from the CFL ocean that we're drowning in during the playoffs and the Grey Cup, and being able to check out some of the other storylines that we may have not been following as closely in the NCAA with some of the Canadians. I begin work on my Abbott's All Canadian list, which of course is an extensive process. I already have most of the players' names down, but checking how they did over the latter half of the season, their statistics, who really shone and surprised me, who didn't have as good a season as I expected, digging into all that information. That's what December is about to me, and I really enjoy that process.
JC, man, I'll give you full credit for that. I don't know how you go through the multiple levels in NCAA football and dig up these Canadians year after year. But whatever you're doing, going back to your days as the ratio breaker, your alternate alias, it seems to work, man. It's awesome stuff.
It's a long process. It's a lot of nights, early mornings as well, going through every single college roster. It's not a glamorous process. A lot of it's done in my underwear, gentlemen, but it gets the job done.
Justin, what's your favorite
take it
part?
down a disgusting route.
What's your favorite part? I'm immediately changing the subject. What's your favorite part of December, Justin?
Honestly, I like when there is some coaching movement that's going on and then the NFL workouts because, Hodge, I got to give you credit for this. The list that you put together in terms of CFL players who could garner NFL attention has been pretty bang on so far. And it gives you a view into how the NFL looks at the CFL. And I think that's particularly important in this day and age because it shows people time and time again every year that the talent in the CFL is legitimate. We know it. Most of the fans that tune into the podcast know it. But I think when you see whether it's Taylor Elgersma getting a workout with the San Francisco 49ers or Jalen Hutchings having a bunch of workouts lined up, Devin Veresuk would be in that group as well. We can go on down the list and we're going to talk about it during the show. It shows that Canadian or American and even sometimes the globals, that this level in the CFL is really, truly an elite level of football. It's a top 1% of football players any way that you slice it. So that's what I like about December. And then also, from the standpoint of you two guys, because you go so hard during the season, I don't necessarily like talking about myself. So I'll give you guys all of the glory that you deserve, that you actually get a little time, the big bears that you are, to go into a little bit of rest mode because there's not a game 3 or 4 nights of the week. I know the playoffs are a little bit different, but make no mistake, we go hard. And I don't know how you guys felt, but after a Grey Cup, and I was talking to some people around the league, when I got back, it seemed like a lot of people were dealing with some sort of a sickness. It hit them pretty hard. I think mine actually hit me during Grey Cup week, and I tried to push through it. So I don't think it necessarily caught JC so bad, but Hodge, it's good to have you back to 100%.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Unfortunately, my wife has what I had, so that's not pleasant for her. But she's getting better. She's fighting through. She's a trooper. So yeah, I definitely a sickness going around Grey Cup. I don't know what it was. I was down for about 3 days, but it's all good. We push through. We carry on, and we're here. So let's do it.
The thing that I liked most, Hodge, is you were down and out, and then all of a sudden there was some action going on. I think it was NFL workouts. And it's like, Hodge is up off the canvas. He's alive. It was great to see.
It's like that gif of the Undertaker sitting up in his coffin.
Yeah.
Boom. There you go.
It's like Hodge hears there's news going on. Vroom, he's back away. Let's go, boys. Today we're discussing the Montreal Alouettes signing 2 key pending free agents to large dollar contract extensions.
The Toronto Argonauts bringing on John Hufnagel as a senior advisor.
The CFL and CFLPA's ability to opt out from the CBA prior to the 2027 season.
JC's list of 1 pending CFL free agent each team should move on from that caused quite a stir, at least from one of those athletes. Eh, JC?
Indeed it did. Indeed it did.
And Canadian quarterback Taylor Elgersma working out for the San Francisco 49ers. But first,
the Toronto Argonauts have officially named Mike Miller the team's new head coach. The 55-year-old Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania native told the media at his introductory press conference that he will serve as his own offensive coordinator and call plays, though the rest of his coaching staff remains unclear. What do you take away from the hiring?
You know, I was thinking about this because, fellas, to be honest, we have been rather harsh on the Toronto Argonauts throughout this process. And then I thought, when Michael Pinball Clemens went out on, I would say, more than a limb to hire Ryan Dinwiddie, there were actually some people who questioned him, right, at that time, because it didn't seem like he was at the top of most people's head coaching candidates list, or he wasn't necessarily the next obvious one. So I'm not necessarily saying this is going to work out to that degree for the Toronto Argos, but we should give them a little bit of a chance, and specifically Pinball Clemens, to see if this can be a successful hire. So I look at Mike Miller and you hear Michael Pinball Clemens talk, which sometimes can be a lot of hyperbole, and we all know sort of the cuddly, feely, fuzzy vibes he likes to try to give people. But it seems like Mike Miller impressed through that process, where it appears as though the Argos interviewed more internal candidates that were already on the staff from 2025 than external candidates. We might not necessarily know that for a fact, but it seems that way. That Mike Miller impressed Michael Pinball Clemens. You would imagine Keith Pelly as well, the president of MLSE, and then some of the other people in the organization that had a say in that decision. The clear focus for me that hiring Mike Miller does for the Toronto Argonauts is it seems to show their commitment to Chad Kelly because of the relationship that those two have had. And I think a lot of people know that Mike Miller wasn't there in the East Final in 2023, where Chad Kelly threw 4 interceptions in that game and then talked about it afterwards, how much he missed Mike Miller not being on the sideline as his quarterback's coach in that game. So it would appear, even though there's been some rumblings behind the scenes about Chad Kelly, that the Argos are seemingly going to go forward with him. Now, we'll see if that actually happens, because he has a $200,000+ bonus due on February 1st. So perhaps there's a restructure there, especially coming off a full year where he collected all of his $600,000+ salary while recovering from that gruesome broken leg in the 2024 East Final. But I think that's what it shows. And then let's also give the Argos an opportunity to show that this can be successful, because Ryan Dinwiddie was plucked by Michael Pinball Clemens, and he was pretty enthusiastic and upbeat about that hiring at that time. So again, I'm not saying it's going to be Dinwiddie 2.0, and I don't think, but the odds would be stacked against Mike Miller for him to win 2 Grey Cups in 4 years in Toronto, just based on the sheer numbers. But let's give the Argos a chance here.
Yeah, it's pretty atypical to hire a head coach who's not previously been an offensive coordinator, at least not in that league, and who was just a position guy. But that is exactly what the Argonauts did, right, with Ryan Dinwiddie. He was a quarterback's guy, seen as a quarterback's guru, and we've also seen this kind of be a thing in the NFL, right? If you want a top quarterback whisperer, whatever you want to call it, to be in your building, oftentimes the only way to really hire that person is to make them your head coach, right? And then maybe some of the more traditional head coaching responsibilities are things that can then be delegated to other members of the staff. Just because if that quarterback's guru is your quarterback's coach, well, they're going to get plucked as an OC in about 2 seconds. And if they do well as an OC, they're going to get plucked as a head coach shortly thereafter. So I like this hiring for the Toronto Argonauts. I do. I think everybody knows that their number one wish list play, or what number one wish list hire would have been Mike O'Shea. They obviously weren't successful in that. But I think that Mike Miller, by all accounts, has done very fine work. He has several years, I believe it's 8 years of NFL coaching experience under his belt, including 2 as an offensive coordinator with the Arizona Cardinals. He's got now ample CFL experience dating back to 2013 when he was on staff with the Montreal Alouettes alongside Dinwiddie. I really liked during his address when Miller took a second to thank Dinwiddie. He said, back in 2013, he told me, if ever I get the chance to hire you, I'm going to do it. And he said, Ryan is, actually did it, kind of implying like, this is something that coaches tell each other all the time. And then once they actually get their head coaching job and they can fill out a staff, suddenly it's like, oh, my hands were tied. I had to hire somebody else. Sorry. So coaches can be cliquey like that. And I thought it was great that Mike Miller, I thought it was gracious that he thanked Ryan Dinwiddie, as did general manager Mike Pinball Clemens. I'm sure there's at least a little bit of hard feelings in that organization with Dinwiddie leaving for an East Division rival, but I thought that was nice. The next thing I want to talk about here, though, is the assistants, right? You just had a slew of internal candidates, just that we know of. That was obviously Miller himself, plus receivers coach Pete Costanza, co-defensive coordinators Kevin Iben and Jason Shivers, and as also special teams coordinator Mickey Donovan, all of whom have parts of resumes that look like future head coaches, right? Guys who I'm sure all want the opportunity to be head coaches in this league. And they've all now been turned over, right? And I think that's probably a bit of a tough pill to swallow, certainly for some of them. And I think this begs the question, like, we know Shivers is under contract with the Argonauts for 2026. The rest of these guys, I've heard kind of mixed things. Some of them say that there's no deal in place for 26. Some seem to imply there's a team option for 2026, looking at the reporting. But regardless, I think you have to wonder now, okay, how many of these guys are going to stick in Toronto and be with Mike Miller? How many of them are potentially going to want to head north to Ottawa with Ryan Dinwiddie? And I think there's pluses and minuses to both scenarios. Obviously, the cost of living in Toronto is very high, but also it's a world-class city. The Argonauts have the better quarterback, arguably, but they also play essentially 12 road games in 2026. That's a challenge, right? That should probably be a consideration. So for personal reasons, professional reasons, I'm interested to see what these assistants decide and also what Mike Miller decides. He might have external people who he's been going, oh, if I ever get the chance to be a head coach, I want this person to coach this group. I want that person on my staff, etc. So now that that's settled, I'm curious to see over the next few days or possibly weeks how Mike Miller fleshes out his staff in Toronto. Because obviously your coaching staff and your assistants is a huge part of what will make you successful or unsuccessful, especially as a first-time head coach.
There is so much left to be determined here, both in terms of the coaching staff. I'm intrigued, just as you are, Hodge, in terms of who gets brought back, but also could we see some new faces, some new names that maybe don't have as much CFL experience that Mike Miller has connections to from stops in the NFL or in the NCAA that come up to Canada for the first time to work under him, bring some new blood into the league. I think that's always a positive. But just overall, we don't know what Mike Miller is going to be like as a head coach. He has never been a head coach at any significant level of football ever. This is his first time. Now, unlike Ryan Dinwiddie, when he was hired straight off of being a QB coach, he has been an offensive coordinator before in 2013 with the Montreal Alouettes. But I would argue we also don't know what he's going to be like as a coordinator this time around either, because That was over a decade ago. He now has much more CFL experience. He has experience with the quarterback that's presumably going to be under center for him in Chad Kelly. It should be noted that Kelly was at the press conference when Mike Miller was introduced as the head coach. He made the trip up for that. What has that time and experience done to change how Mike Miller sees the game, and what is he going to do now that he's given the reins? I think all of these things are up in the air, and you could see it go in a tremendous new direction. I could see him bring new ideas, new concepts, new blood into the league. I could also see a guy struggling who hasn't had this level of responsibility before in pro football, where he's handling head coaching duties for the first time and offensive coordinator duties again after a long time away. That is a big challenge. And as we know with the Argos, there's not a tremendous amount of support from the front office, or at least that was one of Ryan Dinwiddie's complaints as he was leaving the doors, that he had to handle a lot more than most head coaches because of how that front office was structured. Will that be too much for Mike Miller? That remains to be seen, but I can see this going either way for the organization.
You guys mentioned new ideas, and I'm intrigued to see what Mike Miller does with the offense for that reason. I'm not saying we know it's going to be successful for sure, and it's been a long time since he's been an offensive coordinator in the CFL, as JC laid out. But you look at the 2 seasons that he was the offensive coordinator in Arizona with the Cardinals, and those were productive passing seasons for the Cardinals. They had Larry Fitzgerald and Quan Bolden in those years, so you could argue, okay, maybe it's not that hard to be an offensive coordinator when those guys are running around. But I am curious to see if there are new ideas that Mike Miller puts into play here, because you talk to people around the league and they'll say, how do, for lack of a better term, these coaches continue to get opportunities in the CFL that's been around forever and they kind of do the same old thing? I'm not saying there's no innovation, but there are some people that have been waiting for a new wave. Now, Mike Miller isn't necessarily a young and up and coming coach. He's obviously much older, but perhaps he can infuse some new offensive thought processes into the Canadian Football League. So I'm really curious to see what he can do. And if he can help Chad Kelly win an MOP in his first season as the true starting quarterback, I'm sure Ryan Dinwiddie had a lot to do with it too. So I just don't think we can focus on Mike Miller. But that's certainly impressive. And you would imagine that Dinwiddie would have had a lot to do, and I think he deserves the praise as well, with what McLeod Bethel-Thompson was able to do with this team in 2022, and then what Nick Arbuckle was able to do for the Argos in spot duty for Chad Kelly in 2025. But Mike Miller played a role in that. So I would imagine that also played a large role in Michael Pinball Clemens, Keith Pelly, and whoever else was involved in the decision-making process saying, okay, this could be our guy. Because it seems like in the CFL, when you talk to people around the league, and you guys can tell me if you agree or disagree, that most people are looking for that head coach, offensive coordinator style. Now, it's not necessarily the only way that you need to go to guarantee, I shouldn't say guarantee, but to put yourself in the best spot to win Grey Cups. Just look at the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Michael Shea was a special teams coordinator. Look at the Saskatchewan Roughriders who won the Grey Cup. They went head coach, defensive coordinator with Corey Mace. But the key there was that he had a legitimate offensive coordinator in Mark Mueller. So lots of times when these head coaching decisions are being made in the current era of the Canadian Football League, it's like, well, who's your offensive coordinator going to be? If you're not going to be the offensive coordinator, like a Ryan Dinwiddie or a Mike Miller in this instance, or a Dave Dickinson in Calgary, a Buck Pierce in BC, I'm trying not to leave anybody out that holds those dual roles, then who's your guy? Because that's a real key here. So I think that played a factor into Mike Miller getting the job in Toronto.
Yeah, and also just like good for Mike Miller, right? You could hear from his comments how much this meant to him, right? We talk about this in the media, and I think fairly so, that a lot of coaching decisions are just retreads. It's like, oh, so-and-so's getting their, second crack to be a head coach, third crack to be a head coach, in some cases, fourth crack to be a head coach. good for Mike Miller. I feel like he's earned this opportunity. Obviously, it's up to him to prove that he can do the job and do it at a high level. But I'm excited to see what he does. And yes, I thought, as Justin astutely laid out, there's no arguing with his track record with quarterbacks. They've had a ton of success under him. So I'm excited to see what the Argonauts look like under Mike Miller.
The last thing I'll say on this is I'm sure we'll get some pushback to the idea that this will bring new ideas, potentially a new brand of offense to Toronto, because Mike Miller is, of course, 55 years old. He's been in the CFL already. People look at that and they say, well, how could he possibly bring new ideas? He's already been here. I had a fascinating conversation with a former coach during Grey Cup week, and we were discussing about how you get new offensive ideas in football. And he said, it's actually not the way everyone thinks or expects, which is from new coaches that are coming into the league or guys who are straight off of their playing careers, because young coaches don't know what they don't know yet. They're regimented in their old systems, the ones that they've played under, or whoever their one mentor has been. The guys who are the most innovative tend to be the ones who have been in multiple systems throughout their career. They've bounced around, they've learned from a bunch of different people, and then they've had the time to craft their own system. I think that's certainly, based on Mike Miller's resume, is true of him. We'll see if he can execute it into something novel and unique on the field.
I just want to correct myself here, fellas, because I was talking about Mike Miller having multiple 1,000-yard receivers while he was in Arizona. Well, it was multiple, but it was Larry Fitzgerald in back-to-back years. Kevin Cobb was the quarterback at that time for the Cardinals. Beanie Wells was the running back, so he went for 1,000 yards in, I believe, one of those years, if not both. So I was just quickly fact-checking myself. But, I mean, stands to reason. You know, JC's point is definitely intriguing, and Mike Miller's not necessarily, like, super ancient. He's 55 years old. So we see coaches, you know, coach well into their 70s now in professional football. I think some people in the league would like to see some new blood, perhaps coaches in their late 30s or early 40s get in the door. But what Mike Miller was able to do through the interview process led to him getting this job. And I'm not saying that, you know, if I was doing the hiring for a head coach position, that I would want Mike Miller over Ryan Dinwiddie. I don't want anybody to get that twisted. I would take Ryan Dinwiddie over Mike Miller. But considering the circumstances that the Argos were left in, I think that this choice is intriguing. And definitely when the schedule comes out on December 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern time, I'm going to be looking for those games when the Red Blacks play the Argonauts, because there is going to be quite the heated matchup every single time that happens in 2026 and possibly beyond. The Montreal Alouettes inked two key Canadian players to large CFL dollar contract extensions as Tyson Philpot and Pier-Olivier Lestage signed through 2027 and 2028. Respectively. 3DownNation exclusively reported the financial terms for both deals. Philpot will earn $275,000 in hard money in 2026, making him the league's highest paid national receiver. Lestage will collect $240,000 in hard money for 2026, which puts him in the same tier as Ryan Hunter, Logan Ferland, and Drew Desjardins as some of the highest paid national offensive linemen in the CFL. Hodge, what do you make of these big CFL money contract extensions?
Well, let's start with the Montreal Alouettes. I think, you know, and these were guys who were both ranked relatively high on our top 50 free agents list, especially among Canadian players. And to me, this is the Alouettes saying, okay, we've now had a lot of success the last few years, obviously winning a Grey Cup in 2023, finishing first in the East Division in 2024, and then getting back to the Grey Cup in 2025 with a core. And a lot of this core is starting to get expensive, right? And it's impossible to keep everybody in this type of situation. So they're saying, where can we plant our flags, right? Where can we point to a guy who's a pending free agent, say, yes, this is going to be like a cornerstone of our roster, and we're going to pay through the nose to keep them, knowing that we're probably going to lose some other guys who are pending free agents. And one of them is obviously Tyson Philpot. He's 25 years old, entering his prime. I spoke to Tyson at length about this at Grey Cup, and he essentially said, I love Montreal. I love being a recognizable figure in Montreal. It almost feels like I'm from Montreal, which is, I think, noteworthy considering he's from Delta, BC, which is an extraordinarily long distance from Montreal. That being said, he also made it clear that he's talked to lots of veterans in the CFL who have repeatedly told him, you got to get paid when you can get paid, right? Football is not forever. If you have the opportunity to make a bunch of money, you need to capitalize on that. And so clearly he's done that. He was only making 150 this past season. And he's a guy, by the way, who's yet to have a 1,000-yard season, but that's been due to injury, only played 21 games over the last 2 seasons. But if you extrapolate his per game yardage in 24 and 25, it ends up projecting as about a 1,300-yard receiver, a little over that. So he's a guy who obviously has a nose for the end zone, but you can think of as like a 1,300-yard Canadian wideout. There's very few of those in the CFL, if any. And when you have that type of production with that type of passport, that type of age, that is why you're able to get this kind of money, right? And had Philpot gone to market, who knows? He might even gotten more. This deal goes up to $285 in 2027, and $100,000 of that salary is guaranteed. So Philpot is going to be an Alouette for the next 2 years, and he's going to make a ton of money in the process, over $550,000. That's great for him. That's great for his family. He deserves it. Pier-Olivier Lestage, not as much of a bump just because he was already making $190K. But in my opinion, given that he's one of the top interior blockers in the entire CFL, that was an underpay, right? When you look at some of the other guys making more. So I think he well deserves the 240. This is a 3-year deal, and he's also got guaranteed money in the 3rd year of that contract. So I think for the Alouettes, this makes a ton of sense. Is it going to cost them in other positions? Yes. But if you want 2 key Canadian cornerstones, guys who are going to be, certainly in the case of Philpot, a ratio breaker, who are going to be all-star level players for you, these are 2 great guys to pick. And the thing I'm really interested in now, when we look past, beyond the Montreal Alouettes, is what are the ripple effects? Because when you talk to players, agents, teams, whatever, they'll tell you that the market dictates, right, a lot of how these things transpire. What the Alouettes have done by getting these 2 deals done early is they have set the market, right? When you're looking at Brady Oliveira, Sam Emilus, guys who are, again, in their primes as Canadian playmakers on offense who are still pending free agents, they can now look at the Philpot deal and say, okay, the benchmark has been set, the market's been set. And in the case of Lestage, I think the same is true for top Canadian O-linemen who are pending free agents like Brandon Revenberg and Coulter Woodmansey. Revenberg's a little bit older. I talked to him at length at Grey Cup. He's in Essex with his family. He admitted it's going to take a lot to get him out of Hamilton. He's been there his whole career for almost a decade now. But if you're a guy like Coulter Woodmansey, who made $175,000 as, I think, the best center in the CFL in 2025, well, if P.O. Lestage is making 240, if you're willing to go to the market, I feel like Coulter Woodmansey could get 250, 260, dare I say more. And for the other guys, the Canadians here, Brady Oliveira made $240,000 in 2025, easily the highest paid running back. Well, if I'm his agent, who by all accounts is a very tough negotiator, I'm looking at this Philpot deal going, okay, so this guy has never been an all-star. He has never been a 1,000-yard receiver. He has never won a major award. And my guy Brady has won MOP. He's won 2 most outstanding Canadians. He has 4 1,000-yard seasons. And he is the face of a franchise, which, don't get me wrong, Tyson Philpot's obviously a great player, but he's not the face of the Montreal Alouettes. The face of the Montreal Alouettes is pretty clearly Davis Alexander at this point. So if I'm Brady Oliveira in his camp, I'm looking at that number going, okay, I'm not even talking about a contract less than $275 for 2026. And in fact, I think they could easily be talking in the $300,000 range. As for Sam Emilus, he's got the same agent as Tyson Philpot. To me, negotiating with the Saskatchewan Roughriders on an extension, that to me is where the negotiations start. If I'm Sam Emilus, I'm not entertaining a penny less than $275 if Tyson Philpot got that. Because Sam Emilus 2-time 1,000-yard guy. He has more production than Philpot. 275 plus is what I need if I'm Sam Emilus to consider signing anywhere, whether it's Saskatchewan or going to the market.
The Lestage deal to me is very much in line with what top offensive linemen like him deserve to be paid and have been paid. So that one doesn't shock me in any way. I was stunned by the number for Philpot. And it's not that Philpot is not a tremendous player. It's not that he doesn't have sky high potential, because he does. He's just 25 years old. But as you mentioned, Hodge, this deal sets a precedent, and it's not only setting a precedent for what the highest or what the best Canadian receiver in the league has to be paid. It also sets a precedent that availability does not matter that much in these negotiations, specifically for young Canadian receivers, because Tyson Philpot has not been overly available for his team. He played all 18 games as a rookie in 2022. He has yet to achieve that feat since 13 games in 2023. 9 games in 2024, and then 12 games this year. Every single year, there has been an injury that has held him back in some regard, that has kept him off the field. And traditionally, that has an impact on negotiations, right? Your inability to stay healthy knocks some dollars off. It prevents you from setting that top of the market deal. Clearly, that was not an issue for Danny Machocha here. Tyson Philpot gets all that he's worth in terms of his age and his potential. And there's a number of young receivers out there across the CFL who saw that number and they probably started dancing. Sam Emilus, you're hurt for a bunch of this year, but you got 2,000-yard seasons under your belt. You're dancing. Keon Schaefer-Baker, what you've been able to accomplish when you're on the field, you're dancing. If you're Clark Barnes, even with the Calgary Stampeders, you think of the availability challenges he's had, but how young he is and how good he's looked at times when he's playing. You're not going to get up to 275, but you're now got dinner plate eyes thinking about what you potentially could get based on the precedent that this deal sets. So it has a ripple effect across the league. I think there's a lot of teams that are going to have to buck up and pay big money for these young Canadian receivers, regardless of whether they have proven at this stage that they are an all-star or 1,000-yard guy or can be healthy enough to do so, because now the market says you got to pay them like they are, even if they haven't been.
I'll raise you, Mr. John Hodge, 275 for Brady Oliveira and Samuel Emilus, and say, I'm not talking about a contract unless it starts with a 3.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you guys have astutely laid out with Tyson Philpot and the resumes that specifically Oliveira and Emilus have, that number now has to start with a 3 if you legitimately want to sign those players, be it with the teams that they've been with for their entire CFL careers so far or otherwise. And I think this is great for the CFL, the league overall, and specifically the players to be pushing this bar up and up, especially when the salary cap took what the CFLPA said was the second largest jump in CFL history, over $400,000 going into, what was it, fellas, 2025?
Yeah, the bump was going into this year, yes.
Just want to make sure I got my years right. I hit my head too many times playing at Guelph. Everybody out there, you can drink.
Take a drink.
I'm serious. If you're Oliveira or Emilus, that's where it starts. And with Emilus, you talked about him being, nicked up this year, but when he was in the lineup, and Hodge, if you do your quick math on Emilus's numbers, he easily would have been over 1,000 yards and probably in that 1,350 range that you had calculated Philpot on his per game average. And oh, by the way, he was the most valuable Canadian in the Grey Cup. Caught all 10 of his targets for 108 yards in that game to lead his team and actually have a game high 108 receiving yards to help the Rough Riders win their 5th Grey Cup in franchise history. So with Emilus, I think it could be a little bit different because perhaps if you're Jeremy O'Day and the front office staff in Saskatchewan, you go to him and say, okay, look, we really want to keep you here we're going to, let's say, assume for this conversation that Trevor Harris is going to keep playing football. It seems like it's trending that direction. Harris will not ever say who his favorite receiver is or that he has a number one target, but it's clear that the rapport that he's developed with Samuel Emilus stands out among the rest in that talented receiver group, especially the receivers that they had on the 2025 roster. I think of Keyshawn Johnson, who led the Canadian Football League in second down conversions into first downs. He was well over 30 in that department. Dante Myers had a bunch of splash plays and is getting NFL looks. But when Samuel Emilus is on the field for the Riders, there's no doubt that Harris trusts him implicitly, and I think really above any other receiver on the team. So if you're O'Day and the Riders, you'll go, okay, we see this contract out here for Tyson Philpot. We're trying to keep the band together to go for a repeat. You have a pretty good idea that if you stay on this team, you're going to get at least one playoff bonus check, if not a couple. So can you perhaps not max this out in 2025? Perhaps it's a multi-year deal where there's a bigger bump in some of the future years when the Riders perhaps have a different salary cap construction in terms of their roster. So those are some of the discussions that I think could be going on. And I really do think that if I'm Brady Oliveira, especially being a running back, he talked about this, Hodge, you were there for this, that he knows that the shelf life of a running back can be shorter, specifically than some of the other positions. And the fact that he has 4 1,000-yard seasons is great, but he wants to maximize that value. And I think that he is worth that number. If you're going to start it with a 3, I think Samuel Emilus would be in the same ballpark as well. And for the people that don't know out there, the only non-quarterback that earned $300,000 or more dollars in 2025 was Kenny Lawler. And I think he was full value for that contract for the way that he elevated that Tiger Cats offense to another level. I'm not necessarily saying that when you pay guys $300,000+ that they're always going to give you the value back, but I think it's certainly there with Oliveira and Emilus.
I'll just add 2 quick thoughts, and I think you're both totally on point. One is that a lot of times I get feedback from fans who are like, well, how the heck did this team afford this guy, right? Or like, well, how do they keep affording to bring this guy back? Like he's making $200,000 every season or $250 every season. Well, something to remember is the books are always relative year to year. And what I mean by that is if you have a guy making $200,000 who comes back at $215,000 on a new contract, it's easy to get, big-eyed like, whoa, he's making $215. Well, remember, though, that's only a $15,000 increase from the previous season. So if the team was under the salary cap the previous year, they don't have to find $215,000 new dollars for this player. They have to find $15,000 that are new, right? The other $200,000 were already on the books for this same player. So it's always relative. That's why like the Lestage raise is not huge. It's $50,000. That's not nothing. But he was making $190. Now he's making $240. Right, the Philpot one is what's going to stretch the Alouettes. He was making $150. He's now $275. That's going to cost you a good player at another position, right? A guy who's like a talented vet. You're going to have to find someone a rookie deal to replace that. So it's always relative. If Brady Oliveira gets to 300, that doesn't mean the Bombers, for instance, have to find $300,000 new dollars. They have to find $60,000. He was making $240 in and around there in 2025. The other thing I'll say is remember too, most of the deals we're talking about were negotiated under the previous salary cap, which is in and around $5.4 million. Assuming teams actually spend the money for 2026, the cap is going to be over $6 million. So, and by the way, the PA also teased that it could potentially go up again once they get all of the financial documents that are required by the CFL or need to be passed on by the CFL by, I believe the date is January 15th. So, in other words, you might say, whoa, $300,000 for running back, that's crazy. Well, $300,000 on the new cap might end up being the equivalent of about $240,000 on the old cap. So Brady Oliveira might get a $60,000 raise in real money, but have almost the same percentage of the cap. So I would encourage people to just remember, first of all, money is relative year to year, and also it's relative to the cap. Like Sam Emilus getting $300,000 3 or 4 years ago would have been unthinkable to have a Canadian at that high. Now you look at it as a percentage of the cap. Well, in a way, 300 is the new 230, 240, right? Or the 200 is the new 150 that a lot of CFL players have played for a long time. So just try to keep those things in mind when we talk about numbers, because it's going to be a story, obviously, all offseason as marquee free agents either sign back with their current teams or choose to explore the market. The current collective bargaining agreement in the Canadian Football League runs through the start of training camp in 2029. However, the CFL Players Association was asked during Grey Cup week in Winnipeg if the union would consider using its opt-out clause, which can be exercised before training camps open in 2027. In other words, in about 18 months. JC, how could the CFLPA or even the league itself potentially force the two sides back to the bargaining table?
The key piece here to remember, gentlemen, is the TSN television deal, which expires on December 31st, 2026. That's about 13 months away from right now when we're speaking. If the CFL renegotiates that deal, they sign an extension, and the base fee for that television contract with TSN goes up or down in either direction, then either side can come to the other and say, we are going to opt out of the final 2 years of the collective bargaining agreement, and the deal will expire 30 days before the start of training camp in 2027. So that December 2026 date is key. They can let the league know ahead of time if a new TV contract comes down the pipe in the next few months. They can wait until later on in the process to make that decision. But that is what you need to know in terms of how it could happen. And for anyone out there who's asking themselves, well, why would either side want to do this? Why would you want to rip up significant labor peace and risk a strike or a lockout or whatever it may be by going back to the negotiating table? It comes down to the fact that the TV deal is the largest source of revenue for the Canadian Football League. So if the money goes up on that deal, the players will want their fair share of it, and they can only get their fair share of it by going back to the negotiating table and trying to get a piece of that increase. If it goes down, theoretically, and the market isn't there for the CFL on television as it once was, and TSN says, actually, we don't want to spend as much on homegrown local sports, and we're trying to get out, or Bell's trying to get out of the television sports broadcasting game, as has been rumored in the past, and they don't give the CFL as much money, well, then the league may be forced to come to the players and try and claw back some of the financial advances that were made under the previous CBA that we have seen result in revenue sharing and such an increase in the salary cap, because that TV deal essentially pays the salary cap for teams at this stage. So we won't know whether this can be opted out until we have clarity on whether TSN will be back as the league's broadcast partner, but it's something to keep an eye on going forward over the next year.
JC, full credit to you for doing a deep dive and researching the majority of aspects surrounding this potential opt-out. I thought it sort of went under the radar during Grey Cup week. I know there's a lot going on, but the fact that some people and fans of the Canadian Football League think that there's labor peace all the way up until just before the 2029 season is absolutely not the case. And no pressure, Stuart Johnston, with this television deal that he's been asked a bunch about. But we just talked about in the last segment how player salaries have advanced and the salary cap went up over $400,000 before the 2025 CFL season, and the Players Association anticipates at least the possibility of it going up again prior to the 2026 season. Well, that can all come to a screeching halt depending on what happens with the television deal. So that is absolutely massive. And, it's part of the reason I think why a lot of the fans and media, quite honestly, have pushed back so hard on Stuart Johnston and his somewhat unilateral decision to change the rules, specifically the ones in 2027, because this television deal's so massive for the league. I'm not saying that he's not working on it at all, but something that has that amount of stakes should really take up the majority of your focus outside of the operating and pushing the teams forward. So the research that JC has done here is critical, and it shows how absolutely massive the television rights and specifically TSN has been for the league. I think they deserve credit for that. And it should be noted that the CBA directly states TSN in it. Correct,
Mhm.
JC?
It does. It says the TSN deal. It does not say the TV deal. Now, I'm not a labor lawyer, so I don't know if the interpretation of that, if the CFL were to sign with a different broadcaster, if that would be considered the same thing, or if they have to sign with TSN for this clause to be enacted. But the language is very specific. It has to be before the expiry of the current deal. It has to be the base fee going up. So I don't know how the financial structure of that deal works, but it's the base fee, not whatever else is included financially. And it says the TSN deal in the collective bargaining agreement.
Detailed to know.
Yes, and full credit to you, JC. Very well done. And I'll just say this: nobody wants. And maybe I'll just speak for myself, but I feel like I can speak for fans here and members of the media, and even the players. Nobody wants the CBA to be opened early. However, we've seen the way that rights fees have exploded in other leagues. Obviously, the CFL is an excellent property for TSN. There are very few properties in this country that are worth much during the summer. And the other, really, in the sporting world is the Blue Jays. Outside of the Olympics, it's the Canadian Football League. And so if the rights fees even just improve in a similar manner to what we've seen in other leagues for the CFL, I feel like there's no way the PA could responsibly look at its membership and say, hey, we could open this up and potentially get millions of dollars added to the salary cap in one way or another over the next few years. But we're not super keen on going back to the bargaining table. Like, we're going to stick with this deal. Like, I feel like that would never happen. So I feel like, based on, obviously it comes down to the TV deal, but the reason I think that it's noteworthy to talk about, and the reason why we asked the questions and did the journalism here, is because I don't think for a second that this is, too early to talk about it, but like, I think there's a very real chance that the CBA is going to get opened before the 2027 season. And the CFL is not a league that could withstand a work stoppage or certainly lost games. So I don't think we're going to get to like a crazy strike situation. But obviously, if there's a bunch more money available, the PA would be wise to take advantage of that. And I'm also sure that the league's not going to want to, especially post-COVID, give a bunch of money that away. So I think it's going to be very intriguing to follow this. It's something that will be very much a storyline a year from now, especially if assuming I would, of course, think that there will be a TV deal in place by then.
Let's hope, fellas, that the league, I want to get this in real quick, can actually be proactive here for once, okay? Because the CFL Players Association said that essentially they found out just before the public did about the new rule changes, and that they've been assured by Stuart Johnston and the league office and the Board of Governors that there'll be better communication between the two sides in the future. But that's just talk. So what I would like to see here is the CFL and the Board of Governors actually be proactive and involve the Canadian Football League Players Association as true partners, because that's all they're asking for. And without the players on the field, you don't have a league, okay? That is an absolute fact. So if I'm the Canadian Football League, for once, and I'm not saying you even have to treat them nicely, just treat them like partners. If you are coming close to a deal, or the deal happens and you can let the Players Association know, perhaps, heaven forbid, you could go to them early and be proactive and talk before this opt-out deadline and try to keep that labor peace. I think that would go a long way with the Players Association if it didn't just get pushed to the deadline and then they find out about the television deal, what everybody else does. Have those discussions behind the scenes, treat them as partners, and then keep that labor peace as long as you can and break off a piece of the pie that the players deserve. I get it. Everybody wants their cut. And when you boil it down, usually it's pretty selfish. But for the betterment of the league in many ways, you need to treat the players as true partners. And I think you could even go to another level where we talk about recruiting American players to potentially come up here, especially with the expanded practice rosters in the NFL, that if the salaries are larger, perhaps you attract the bigger name talent up here more quickly than what happens right now. So I think there's a way that the CFL can go about this. And if Stuart Johnston is going to be held at his word, let's see if he actually is more communicative with the Canadian Football League Players Association in what is absolutely a massive moment for the league as a whole, the teams around it, the owners, and the players.
It's a very good point, Dunk, and I think it's worth noting that in both of their addresses, the State of the League and the State of the Union, Commissioner Stuart Johnston and the PA gave a rather rosy picture of their relationship currently in the early stages. They're still getting to know one another, but they had a bit of a clash over the rule changes, as you highlighted there. It seems there have been some efforts made to mend those fences, but that's all talk until you get into the nitty gritty. One thing that stood out was David Mackey, the executive director of the PA, was talking about their non-voting seats on the CFL Ventures Board, which is the league's revenue arm. And he said previously, under Randy Ambrosie, when they were on those calls, they got 5 minutes and then they got booted out for the rest of the board that was voting to do their proper business. And he said that that was unacceptable. Now with Stuart Johnston, they're on for almost the entire call before the official voting has to take place. That's a positive step. But does that continue if you're getting into a situation where the CBA might potentially be opted out from and things get contentious with the players? Once negotiations happen, relationships will get tested and it won't be quite so rosy. You need to keep that same energy when things are getting tough with the players.
It's a totally different relationship when it's new and cuddly, and all fuzzy, and you got the vibes, going out on the first date. That's kind of what happened here until you get to the bargaining table and somebody gets punched in the face. Because Solomon Elamimian and the Players Association have shown that they are going to stand tall and be steadfast in what they want. And the last time, that almost led to missed regular season games. So Stuart Johnston better look at that situation and go, we can't afford that. We need to involve the players as legitimate, true partners. And I get everything's all rosy and great right now. But until you get to that bargaining table, that's going to be the talk. And then you start delivering body blows and, you're trying to get what's best for your side. I understand that's all part of the business as well. But I think there's a more perhaps professional way you can go about this, especially considering that the players showed some real grit last time and were willing to go through potentially lost game checks. And that takes, the majority of the union to agree on for Elamimian and the PA to go forward with that if I'm Stuart Johnston, I'm looking at that and going, hey, I don't want that on my watch. I want it to be fair and equitable for all parties, but I don't want to have it like that. And, you mentioned something there, JC, and I know that he's gone and out the door and people don't think about him a lot, but this is why I talk about words matching up with actions. Randy Ambrosie would wax poetic about getting up every morning and thinking about the players in the Canadian Football League. Oh, yeah? Then they get 5 minutes on that call? Come on, man. That's just complete BS. So that's why I put the challenge out there to the league, because in the past, they've tried to, and I think successfully in a lot of the negotiations, just shove the players around. But Elamimian and the PA have shown, at least at that last negotiation, that they're not standing for that treatment anymore. And you cannot have a Canadian Football League without everybody. I know I focused on the players earlier, but everybody. Ownership is the most stable it's ever been. Television ratings, attendance is up, even if marginally, year over year. So why not keep the positive momentum going? Be proactive instead of reactive. So again, that's why it's key. It's definitely worth talking about it now, because that deadline is going to come really quick. As JC said, like, we're less than 13 months away from that deadline. Time flies. And the CFL is going to actually hold up to what Stuart Johnston said and communicate with the players. We need to see the proof of that for the betterment of everybody involved, and ultimately for the betterment of the fans and the long-term fans in this league.
The Toronto Argonauts are set to hire John Hufnagel as a senior advisor following his nearly 20-year run with the Calgary Stampeders. When did you hear that move could be possible?
I heard about a week ago, and honestly, fellas, I did not think it would be possible. I'm like, John Hufnagel seems to be a Calgary Stampeder through and through. I know he played for, other franchises in the Canadian Football League, but I was shocked and taken aback. And it's one of those things that you hear, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this as well, where you go like, that can't be real. And then you start looking into it a little more, and it sounds like it has some legs to it. And then, ultimately, it seems like this is something that is going to come to fruition. So I am curious how this happened on Calgary's end with his relationships there, especially Dave Dickinson. Like, John Hufnagel essentially helped Dave Dickinson get to where he is now. I'm not saying that there's never going to be a passing of the torch, but I have so many questions about how this came to fruition, and how John Hufnagel was like, yeah, I'm going to leave Calgary and go to Toronto. Like, that in and of itself is a big culture change.
It is. And I mean, you got to give a ton of credit to John Hufnagel with what he accomplished in Calgary. 102, 41, and 1 as a head coach. As a GM, he was 175, 70, and 3. When you have over double, even in some cases almost triple the wins as you do losses, that's pretty remarkable. 3 Grey Cups from 2008 to 2022, which was his tenure as GM. Look, I think it's fair to say that John Hufnagel, especially late in his tenure, was not a great president for the Calgary Stampeders. Obviously, they've been able to turn things around at least a little bit in the short term here in terms of attendance and improvements to McMahon Stadium and improvements to the treatment of their players. But the late term of his presidency aside, John Hufnagel was the reason why the Calgary Stampeders, or at least I shouldn't say was the reason, he was probably the primary reason why that team was the flagship franchise of the Canadian Football League for a decade. And honestly, I think he's a perfect fit with the Argonauts, right? The Argonauts have Michael Pinball Clemens as their general manager, a guy who a lot of people in the league will tell you is kind of a figurehead, not super involved on a day-to-day basis. I'm not saying that's my opinion. I'm just saying that's what I've been told. John Murphy does a ton of the work there, and he has been on his own since Vince Magri and Alex Russell left and were not replaced, right? This is something that we talked about on the show when Ryan Dinwiddie was talking about some of what I think can fairly be described as dysfunction in that organization. So for a guy like John Hufnagel, who, at his age, the man's in his mid-70s, probably doesn't want to be doing, 40, 50, 60 hours a week of day-to-day tasks, but a guy who knows what to look for in players, who knows how to set a culture in a building, who knows all aspects of how a professional organization should work, I think is a nice fit, especially because he and Murphy worked together for many years during the start and arguably most successful portion of Hufnagel's tenure in Cowtown. So I like this move a lot for the Toronto Argonauts. This is the perfect type of role, I think, for a guy like John Hufnagel at this point of his career. And I think the fact that he has this, what might be a last chapter outside of Calgary, could add an interesting little wrinkle to his legacy. I mean, the guy's already in the Hall of Fame, but his story's not over. So I'm interested to see what this looks like in Toronto.
I agree with everything that you laid out there, Hodge. Typically, I'm a little bit wary of these sort of senior advisor retread roles because sometimes I do think guys, as much as experience is valuable, you don't necessarily want to do things the same way they've always been done. And everybody in every business has a best before date. But when you're the Toronto Argonauts, you want as much help as you could possibly get in that front office. And John Hufnagel has as illustrious a resume as you could find anywhere in the Canadian Football League. I think he will be a net positive for this organization and help them find a little bit more equilibrium going forward, assist Pinball Clemens with some of his maybe deficiencies as a general manager by bringing more of the true roster management side to it.
There's a couple things that come to mind here for me about John Hufnagel. First of all, he's 74 years old. And JC, I hope you're comfortable sharing the story, still locked in to football. Can you share that story about how you were on the elevator with him and he was talking about the loss in BC?
Oh, yes. Now, I gotta recall it. Yeah, after the playoff loss, it was him and Bob Slowick, the defensive coordinator, in the elevator discussing what happened on the final drive of that West semifinal game, and Slowick was trying to explain quietly in the corner of the elevator what had happened, maybe how they allowed those final points to be scored. And Hufnagel just shook his head and said, "We gave them too much time. We scored too quickly." And you could tell that he was locked in on maybe some of the failures on the offensive side of the ball that we talked about at that time that led to that final BC scoring drive. So he was very sharp in that moment.
It's clear that he still loves football. And I have heard it myself that if you are by the suite or box that he is in for a game, the highs and lows that Hufnagel goes through, cheering or perhaps, the not so great moments, you'll know about it if you're right beside his box. I'm sure there's some fans out there that know what I'm talking about. On the flip side, though, to one of the points that you guys made earlier, the Calgary Stampeders have not won a playoff game while John Hufnagel has been there since 2018. So I'm not saying he can't benefit the Toronto Argonauts, but that was something that when I questioned him about it, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, he did not like at all. But it was just the facts. And I was essentially saying, why has this team not been able to win a playoff game since 2018? And he, what would the terminology be for this? Took exception to that question and didn't really like it. But it was the facts. So I will say this. Get used to it, John Hufnagel. If you come to Toronto and you have an interview with 3DownNation, we are going to ask you fair and factual questions about what went on in Calgary, how you left, and then perhaps how you believe you can reinvigorate the Toronto Argonauts, especially I'll talk about, the front office staff, because Ryan Dinwiddie did win 2 Grey Cups there in 4 years. So I think this could potentially be a positive move, and we'll see how it shakes out for the Argos.
JC, you listed one pending free agent each CFL team should move on from, though you also, I guess, just in the interest of pissing everybody off, added 3 honorable mentions to each team. Pissing off 9 players was not enough. We got to do 36, I guess. Which names do you think surprised the most people?
Look, I do this list every year, and it's intentionally supposed to be inflammatory. There's lots of players on any given team that you could very easily say, okay, this guy's obviously at the end of his career. His production has dropped off entirely. he should go. That's not what this list is about. It's about picking a prominent player, a popular player, somebody that fans may want to bring back that perhaps a team should think twice about. And it's not saying that the team will do this. It's just saying here is an argument in favor of it. I think the one that I got the most pushback for, perhaps predictably so, from Saskatchewan Roughrider fans was Keon Schaefer-Baker. And as I laid out in the article, under normal circumstances, you'd never think of walking away from a player like Schaefer-Baker, right? He's 27 years old. When healthy, he's proven he can be a top-flight Canadian receiver in this league. All of those things are something you want to cling to. But as I laid out in the article, and we discussed earlier in the show, Tyson Philpot has just set the market for Canadian receivers at $275,000. Samuel Emilus is going to want that. And Keon Schaefer-Baker is going to want closer to that. I don't know that you can bring both of those guys back. And to me, if you have a choice between the two, you take Emilus 10 times out of 10 because Schaefer-Baker throughout his career has struggled to consistently stay healthy. Now, you also have to pay out some other receivers. Dante Myers, if he doesn't go to the NFL, is a guy who needs a new contract, won't be playing on a rookie deal anymore. Keyshawn Johnson won't be playing on a rookie deal anymore. You go down the list, there's 8 pending free agent receivers in Saskatchewan that all have to be paid if you want to bring them back. They've got good Canadian depth with guys that are under contract, like Del Duncan Busby and Ajoa Joe. That, to me, makes Keon Schaefer-Baker expendable, even though he's a player that generally you would like to have on your roster.
All right. The person who directly gave you the most pushback, which I actually thought was well-rounded, was Braylon Addison, who quote tweeted your article not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times to his over 18,000
it was actually 6 by the end.
followers on X. Okay, perhaps even more than 4. And he said, I'm going to read a little bit here. I usually don't do this on the podcast, but it's worth it. JC, I would strongly disagree with some of your words in your part about me. This is Braylon Addison on X, saying that Redblacks should move on from me and I don't excite you? ? Fine. But to say that me being a key piece to a team in 2025 is simply unbelievable is a bit of a stretch. LOL. But since you probably read stats, the stats say at the unbelievable age of 32, when by contract I was the 4th option on the team, finished the year with 825 yards while missing 4 games due to a sprained AC joint and bruised ribs and kidney. I tied the team lead in receptions over 30 yards. I think he's saying with 3. He adds 2, so it could be 2 or 3. Of the 4 screens, 2 of the 4 I had were screens. Oh, here we go. He's saying, this is awful, but let me get through this. 3 plays over 30 yards. Anyways, instead of reading it all, I just think that the feedback from Braylon Addison was great, and it was respectful because he actually ended it by saying, much love, JC. So the fact that you put your nuts on the line every year to do this piece, and then there's also the old age piece that you've done in the past, I believe it is, that Trevor Harris still refers to. What was the title of that one?
Call the nursing home.
Yeah, call the nursing home.
Trevor Harris actually almost referenced it word for word. Catch attention. I think is great. It's not necessarily the reason why we do it, but it's because teams actually have to make these decisions every single year, right? As you laid out with Keon Schaefer-Baker, it's like if we sign Keon Schaefer-Baker back, man, I can't speak in this section, for, let's just say it's like the $275,000 that Tyson Philpot got. Well, that means that we're not probably going to be able to bring back, Samuel Emilus at $300,000 or a Keyshawn Johnson at $200,000 plus, or Dante Myers at over, probably he's going to command $200,000 plus. So there's these real decisions that teams have to make. And the Saskatchewan one, to me, is intriguing, yes, because of their Grey Cup champions, but also because Keane Schaefer-Baker is, by all accounts, you talk to the people in merchandise sales over there with the Rough Riders, he's usually among, if not the top selling jersey for the Saskatchewan Rough Riders. But then you look at the depth chart and you have Del Duncan Busby still on a rookie contract. Joe still on a rookie contract. Tommy Neal seemingly coming into his own with this team, who is a pending free agent. You have Mitchell Picton, who has shown that, whenever he gets into a game, he can play literally any position in the receiving core, and he can make plays as well. He's a pending free agent. So these are actual decisions that teams have to make. So just because you're saying that a team should get rid of, in this example, a Keane Schaefer-Baker or a Braylon Addison, doesn't mean that you think they're not great players. I guess Braylon Addison doesn't excite you for whatever reason. But you're saying that there's decisions there that have to be made in the front offices across the league.
Yeah, and just to respond to Braylon, I commend him for doing this in a respectful manner. I've had players come back at me in the past that have been less respectful. I have a bit of an acerbic tone when I write. Nothing personal against you, Braylon. I would suggest that in the future, there's a little plus sign at the bottom of a tweet. You can actually make it all in one thread instead of 6 different tweets.
No, it's better this way. I like it this way.
But
then everybody sees all of the quote tweets.
It is true. It makes it a little bit difficult to follow, but he makes good points. He's not in this article because he's a bad player. In fact, he's in this article for the opposite reason. But I would suggest, he's closer to the end of his career than the start. And the most important statistic, if you want to accuse me of statistic watching, is not the 800 yards receiving that he had. It's the 4 wins that his team produced. And I think if you point to that, something's got to give for that football team. I think there were things on the offensive side of the ball that were not good enough for them. And I would have liked to see schematically some things changed and some things changed personnel-wise, and that's why I wrote the column. But kudos to Braylon for doing it in a respectful manner. I have a ton of respect for him as a player, what he accomplished. I think he was tremendously underrated for a lot of his career with the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Now, I think he is probably a piece that you add later on in the process. It's just not somebody, when you're ushering in a new era with an organization, that I would prioritize highly to bring back. Nothing to add,
Hodge, you got anything? I thought
No,
you were
we're
about
up
to jump
against
in.
the clock. We got to get to it.
All right, we'll move on to JC's random neg lister then. This week, I've got another small school guy who was just added to the BC Lions neg list on December 1st, I believe. That's receiver Kyle Dixon from Culver Stockton College in the NAIA. This guy's 6'4". He is 215 pounds. Certainly looks the part of a pro receiver, and he's starting to get a little bit of NFL buzz at this stage in the process. How does that happen for a guy at such a small school? Well, he wasn't originally at such a small school. He wasn't originally even a football player. This guy was a D1 baseball pitcher, first at Southern Illinois and then at Southern Illinois Edwardsville. He sort of grew disillusioned with the sport of baseball, wasn't having the production that he desired, so he returned to his roots as a high school all-state receiver and found a home at Culver Stockton College, transferring down to the NAIA. In his first game, gentlemen, he made an instant impact, 189 yards and 2 TDs in his debut, and it's been nothing but success since then. 22 games played over 2 seasons, 143 receptions, 2,394 yards, 24 touchdowns, 2 straight first-team all-conference selections. You watch this guy play with his size. It's a man against boys at that level. He's effortless. He has a great release. He stacks defenders with ease. He'll get physical with you as a blocker. And because he has only been playing college football for 2 seasons and against such a low level of competition, you'd see some high developmental upside there. He's going to get some fringe NFL looks. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets some rookie minicamp invites, potentially even a UDFA contract. But if he slips through the cracks, this is a guy that the BC Lions can potentially target here as someone to bring into camp who may have higher upside than his school size would suggest.
Time for Hodge's Heritage Moment. On this day in 2008, a weirdly fitting one today, boys, John Hufnagel was hired as the head coach and general manager of the Calgary Stampeders. The longtime quarterback and assistant coach would lead the Stamps to immediate success, capturing the 96 Grey Cup in a 22-14 victory over the Montreal Alouettes. The Pennsylvania native would step down as the team's head coach after the 2015 season to focus on his role as general manager and assume the role of president, finishing that 8-year tenure with a 102-41-1 record with 2 Grey Cup wins. He, of course, won a third in 2018 as the team's general manager. He was also voted the CFL's Coach of the Year twice and was elected to the Canadian Football Hall of Fame in 2020. Interesting that 17 years later, to the day, John Hufnagel is headed east to the Toronto Argonauts.
Let's go to the 3-minute drill. The Edmonton Elks have re-signed defensive end Brandon Barlow to a 1-year contract for 2026. Does that make sense, Hodge?
I think it makes sense if he's going to get more than 2 sacks in 2026, because that's all he had in 2025. The BC Lions have signed former 4th-round NFL draft pick Jalen Darden. Where do you see him fitting in?
I think he could be a guy in the return game. That's what he was used as in the NFL, but he was a speedster as a slot receiver at North Texas. I think he could be the deep threat that the BC Lions have been missing the last few years in that receiving core. I'm excited to see what he can do in training camp. Canadian quarterback Taylor Elgersma worked out for the San Francisco 49ers on Monday. Do you think he'll be offered a contract by the Niners?
There's a possibility in the future. Elgersma's feedback from the Niners was very positive, through with great velocity and accuracy by all accounts of the people on hand there. So definitely something to keep an eye on. And also, I think that could spark other workout interest from NFL teams around the league. Trey Vavel and Devin Verasuk, West and East finalists for most outstanding rookie, both worked out for the New Orleans Saints on Tuesday. Do you think either guy will sign an NFL contract?
Honestly, I think both have a good chance. They've both got a lot of workouts lined up. And I think when you look at a guy like Vavel with the new return rules in the NFL, that could help his cause. And then with a guy like Verasuk, who is yet to be in the NFL, get an NFL contract, I think that makes him tailor-made for that league. The CFLPA report cards are expected to be out in December, with Union President Solomon Elamiming touting how many positive changes came after last year's inaugural report cards. Do you think we'll see better grades than we did a year ago?
I do think we'll see some improved teams. He highlighted some of the changes in Calgary, Winnipeg with travel, BC. I also think the Edmonton Elks are hopeful that they'll get better than their last place grade from a year ago, but the proof will be in the pudding when the report cards come out. The CFL and CFLPA both indicated that they're open to discussing public salary disclosure for the players. Do you think both sides should do it?
It doesn't matter. 3DownNation already got it covered, baby. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers signed a linebacker named, get this, Johnny Hodges. Are y'all cousins or something? What's going on here?
I may or may not have informed the Winnipeg Football Club that I will be expecting a small stipend from each jersey sold if and when Johnny Hodges cracks the active roster in Bomberland. Former CFL linebacker Alex Singleton returned to action with the Denver Broncos 3 weeks after cancer surgery. How incredible is that?
It was profoundly inspirational, him making his health battle public and coming back so quickly. And not only that, making huge plays in that football game, a key knockdown down the stretch that helped force the game to overtime, putting pressure in the QB on deciding plays. Alex Singleton has always been a stud. He will continue to be a stud, and we're so happy to see him healthy. Riders receiver Dante Myers worked out for the Minnesota Vikings on Tuesday. Do you think he could get a legitimate shot in the NFL?
It's a possibility. I saw some CFL fans in my feed talking about him being too small, but with all the splash plays he made for the Riders, how do NFL teams not take notice of that? I think this guy has the ability to play at that level. We'll see if he can get a legitimate opportunity. CFL All-Star defensive lineman Jalen Hutchings also worked out for the Minnesota Vikings on Tuesday. How many NFL workouts does he have lined up, Johnny Hodges?
Right now, he's only got 2, but I'd expect it to be more. He obviously was sensational in 2025. In my opinion, the best defensive player in the CFL. Rough Riders assistant GM Kyle Carson said thanks, but no thanks to the Hamilton Tiger Cats GM job. Sorry, I stole your line, JC. Does his decision signal to Saskatchewan the band is trying to stay together for a repeat?
I think it could. If you're Kyle Carson helping negotiate pending free agent contracts with the long list of Rough Riders that are on that queue, so to speak, there's 44 of them, by the way. You say, hey, I had the opportunity to go to Hamilton as a general manager, decided to stay here because I truly believe we can repeat. So it's different than somebody saying, well, hey, I just got a big raise. Do you want to come here do you want to stay here for less? So I think it could definitely help some of those people, the front office and the coaching staff, and most importantly, the players stay to try to go back to back in Saskatchewan. Dylan Mitchell was arrested after allegedly leading police in Arkansas on a high-speed chase. What does it mean for his future with Winnipeg and in the Canadian Football League?
Well, unfortunately, with the way his play has fallen off, I don't think Mitchell was likely to sign another CFL contract. He's a free agent as of February. If and when he is proven guilty of this, I would expect that just cements that. Hopefully, for his sake, he gets the help that he needs. For Justin Duncan, JC Abbott, we thank you as always for listening to the 3DownNation podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter, which is the best newsletter that has ever newslettered. We will see you next week for our next episode of the show, and we've got some exclusive interviews booked between now and then. So stay tuned to the channel, YouTube, podcast feed, all that stuff for those. We'll see you then.